The first tiebreak game of the 2016 World Chess Championship is in the books. It was a game of 25 minutes plus a 10-second increment that saw Sergey Karjakin, the challenger from Russia, take the white pieces against Magnus Carlsen, the reigning world champion from Norway, and this is what happened. Another Ruy Lopez, no big surprise, right? Karjakin sticking to his guns, not only from the perspective that obviously he prepared the Ruy Lopez coming into this match, but also in terms of his match strategy approach, that he's willing to repeat things that he played earlier despite limited success because he's relying on the team upstairs, that not being some mythical or omnipotent character, that being his actual seconds in the hotel room upstairs, preparing very, very hard and using their work ethic to hopefully catch Carlsen trying to repeat something that he played before and maybe get a worse version of things. This game right here was played in both games 2 and games 11, so that's not just Danny's theory or lip service. At this point, I think Karjakin's match strategy has been proven that he wanted to reach these Ruy Lopez positions, both in terms of his field, that he enjoys playing the Spanish, obviously, but also that he's hoping Carlsen will at some point venture into something that he played earlier in the match and then maybe regret it. In this position here on move 9, we saw Magnus Carlsen, after castles actually knight c3. In this position on move 9, we saw Magnus Carlsen play the move knight a5 in game 2. You can go check out the video analysis I did for that on my personal YouTube channel, youtube.com/Daniel Rensch. Then he also played the move bishop to e6 in game 11, also a game that I fully analyzed in a video there on my YouTube channel. And so talking about the tension there in the position between the bishops, between the knight gaining the tempo on the bishop, and all the tactical and strategical nuances in those variations can be found in those videos, so I'm not going to do that here. But instead, I'm going to move forward with the move that was played by Carlsen, knight b8, and actually touch quickly on what has clearly been seen as his match strategy. We just talked about how Karjakin wants to use the opening that he knows best, despite whether or not the Norwegian is comfortable on the black side of the Spanish, which Carlsen certainly is. So he wants to use what he prepared and the positions he knows best. He's going to stick to his guns and not change it, and he's going to hope to prepare and improve mid-match. Now, normally this sort of strategy is used in longer-term matches where you have even more opportunities to really catch your opponent repeating things and for your seconds to do their job. But in a shorter match, we haven't seen Karjakin able to really improve yet, and that's partly because of the match strategy that Carlsen has employed that I'm about to talk about right now. Carlsen hasn't repeated anything he played earlier. As I just said, in game 2, he played knight a5. In game 11, he played bishop e6, and now we see knight to b8, which may seem counterintuitive at first, but the ideas behind this maneuver, this is sort of the Breyer variation of the actual closed Spanish. It's not exactly the Breyer variation, but it's a similar idea. The knight comes to b8 because it has intentions of maybe coming to the king side via the move knight b to d7. Depending on what happens, maybe the knight replaces this knight on f6, like maybe this knight gets involved in some trades. Maybe the knight on d7 supports the center, whether that's protecting e5 or c5. Or maybe in some cases the knight will actually come back to c6, but do so after the pawn is on c5. We always know we want our pawns posed behind pawns when possible, because that increases our strength and our control over a position, because a knight directly behind a pawn always controls the same squares the pawn does. So knight to b8 is slow, but there's not really an immediately aggressive way for white to try to take advantage of it. If d4 is played, Carlsen may have had knight b d7 planned, but he may have also just intended to just take on d4 and then play the move c5. And now we're going to get this really sort of double-edged scenario where black has permanently weakened the d5 square and the d6 pawn, but white's bishop has been locked out of the game. White can now do his best to try to prevent black from playing d5, which will eliminate both two weaknesses with one move, right? Eliminate the d6 pawn and that the d5 square is open. So this would have been a pretty dynamic game. The evaluation, as we can see, of the engine above me, for those of you who don't like the engine running, please just ignore it. You can see it still gives white a little bit of an edge in these positions, but I think it's unbalanced, to be fair, and maybe actually the move bishop to b7, which does the same idea of supporting d5, but in this variation actually gains a tempo on the e4 pawn with the knight and bishop meeting together here. could be just as good. So I think that's why Karyakin avoids d4, which means, again, the only way to really punish an undeveloping move by your opponent is usually to strike, create tension and tactical dynamics in the center. Otherwise, you're just, it's not fun to see pieces on the back rank, but they're just cute and they're sitting there, and how are you going to take advantage of it? So unless there's a concrete way to start creating tactical nuances where these pieces and their absence is truly missed, then knight b8 is a move you can get away with. So for those of you who are more advanced players and already know that this is still theory here, come on, Danny, just forgive me, because I'm really trying to set the foundation of what's going on strategically in terms of both sides' plans, so that as the position becomes more dynamic and tension builds, maybe we have a little more of a fundamental understanding of how we got there and therefore what the players are thinking. So after knight to b8, as I said, d4 didn't happen by Karyakin. He played the move knight to e2. This is more of a traditional Spanish idea. The knight is relocating itself to g3. Maybe it pops into f5 at some point. It also has the intention of maybe clearing the c3 square so that it help push d4. And now Carlsen played the move c5 and then brought the knight back to c6. Now, before you go crazy and say, well, how could this idea by Carlsen ever be considered good? If you're going to move the knight, push the c-pawn, and then bring the knight back to c6, isn't it always better to do it with a tempo? Well, remember, knight a5 was played in game 2, so one, Carlsen has a practical reason not for playing knight a5, which is he's not interested in seeing what Karyakin's team prepared as an improvement. But also, it's not that simple. If you play knight a5 and then c5, which is not what Carlsen did in game 2, he played knight a5 and then bishop e6. And part of the reason is because if you play knight a5 and then c5, based on this theory I just started with, well, if Karyakin goes knight e2 and you go knight c6, now you've reached the same position as in the game, but black is up a full move. White hasn't established this knight on g3. But it's not that simple. It's because, again, if you play c5 and knight with the knight on a5, white's not going to play knight e2. Most often, white will actually try to use the d5 square, whether that's knight to d5. In some cases, even b4 and then bishop d5. In some cases, the knight is potentially eliminated by an idea like bishop to g5 and then the d5 square, as you can see, is a very permanent weakness. So the tactical dynamics in the center are going to take a different path if you try to play knight a5 with c5. Why wouldn't white try to go for the knight d5 stuff with the knight on b8? Well, first of all, because when the knight went to b8, we already know that Karyakin played knight to e2. And that's because you can't really fill the d5 square if the pawn hasn't committed, because I have c6 if I want to kick you out. So you see that it's yes, it seems like a little bit of a loss of tempo for black, but it's not that simple. There are different tactical approaches that would be taken depending on where that knight is. So if black wants this position with the pawn on c5 and the knight behind it, the proper way to reach it is, in fact, the way Carlsen did it, not with the knight on a5. So hopefully, what I'm explaining there makes sense as to the Spanish middle game that we're reaching here. After the move c3 is played by Karyakin, this is typical. Rook to b8. This is white preparing for the classic Spanish, I'm going to gain space in the center, and black saying, well, I've already beat you to it, buddy. I've got space on the queen side, and I know how to use it. It's not just the size of my space, it's how I use it. And after h3, here he comes with a5. He's going to push it, and Carlsen wants the whole thing on the queen side. But there's an issue with a5. a5 is a move that allows the common undermining idea that is actually something that's possible in this variation. For those of you who are Ruy Lopez fanatics, I'll just go back here because I love teaching. I'll say that if you really want to dive into this line, you can also analyze a4 as an option here. We've spent a lot of time looking at the a3 line because that's what Karyakin has played in games 2, 11, and now tiebreaker game 1. So I analyze the dynamics of this line very much in my YouTube videos. But a4 is also a totally possible idea, and it makes sense to try to undermine the b5 pawn because the pawn on a6 is pinned to the rook on a8. But the problem is that playing a4 now is a little bit different. This pawn on a6 still being able to guard b5 means, one, if I play rook b8, you're not really threatening to destroy my pawn structure. I still have all of the light squares held together. Two, I actually can consider playing b4, which I think is theory in a lot of these lines, and try to use the a5 square for my knight. So back to the game where Karyakin played a3, if we're talking about what did we just learn from that, Karyakin is playing a4 now after the pawn has come to a5 because now there's no pawn on a6 just backing up the space advantage, right? In a situation where that pawn is protected, you're sort of wasting your breath if you play a4 first because you're not threatening anything. Now you are threatening something. You're threatening to open up the light squares and maybe try to start poking in at all these squares, d5, c4, b5. That's what Karyakin wants to do, and that's what his intention was with a4. But the game is still very dynamically equal. You can either believe me in terms of the balance I'm explaining of white wanting the light squares and wanting the Spanish idea, black getting the space on the queen side, or you can just believe the computer engine above me, which gives the evaluation, very close to equal, bouncing back and forth in a not very high positive or negative direction. So after b4 is played, Karjakin, it plays rook e1. We're going to get a completion of both sides' development. Bishop e6, as you know, in a lot of these positions, is not something that white really seriously considers capturing. If you capture here, you better have an immediate way to expose the weak e6 pawn and maybe the light squares, because long term, the f-file is going to favor black's counterplay, and the only other way to try to expose the weak pawns is to play d4 and strike in the center, which is going to undouble them anyway. So unless a move like queen to b3 and then knight g5 was possible, this is really not the kind of thing that white even wants to go for. And as you can see, tactically, it's simply not possible because of b takes c3, where queen takes c6 will be met by trades and then takes on b2. And if you take with the queen on c3, well, among other things, you have a serious outpost square to deal with on d4. So the point is that there's just no tactical consequences to this doubling of the e-pawns, which again is why Karjakin didn't do it. He played a very smart move here, bishop to c4. This is sort of staring your opponent in the face, right? Like two rams locked in a head-butt battle. Neither side is going to trade. They're going to tempt the other person to trade and do something that aesthetically, indeed, it looks uncomfortable for white to maybe even have doubled isolated c-pawns. But these pawns are, looks are not everything, and these pawns can be deceptively useful for white because together they control very critical squares, keeping this knight at bay. They also control b5 and d5. And now that light square bishop is gone, you bet that white is going to start aggressively looking to use it for his play with knight f5. So taking on c4 is just not something black wants to do either. But what that means is if white doesn't want to take e6 and black doesn't want to take c4, that means the players now have to find a way to develop while maintaining good versions of that tension for themselves, which is an instructive point I want to talk about here because when I do these videos, my goal is to not just give you a blow-by-blow, this was game 10 and here's what happened. Okay, whatever, thanks. We can run a computer to see that. I want to hopefully try to draw out some educational tips that make the viewers feel like they learned something from these two. One of the things that makes a good player, as you stop blundering, let's say you've got your tactics together, you're playing at like a 15, 1600, 1700 level, but to really outplay somebody, you have to start developing high-level plans. It's not just about blundering tactics anymore. Well, the way you develop a high-level plan is often not just making the correct decisions of where your pieces need to be in the current setting, in the current position, but also improving the positions of those pieces while making sure you don't mess anything up in the current set. It's like the amateur knows where the pieces should be if I just put the position in front of you and say, where's the weak squares? But the master knows how to improve that position while maintaining the tension so that they're still able to stare the other person in the face, preventing their plans, but also find a way to improve their pieces. You want to have your pieces on the best squares, not just in the current pawn structure, not just in the current situation, but in the potentially next step, the evolving pawn structure, the evolving next situation. So that means the players now have to kind of improve their pieces while maintaining that sort of gridlock. h6 is a move that is prophylactic. It guards the g5 square, so now black feels a little bit safer in case he does ever let that happen. White plays bishop e3, completing the development, still staring this in the face and maybe creating a situation where, again, if the d-file becomes open, white is ready to use the light squares. And now that I've completed my development as white, now that I've developed my bishop, I can quickly double on the d-file. So there you go. After queen to c8, we get queen to e2. Queen to c8 is maybe bluffing at the idea of taking with the queen, but probably not. The queen coming to e2 is using the d1 square. Again, so notice we're developing, but we're maintaining an eye on the way the position can evolve. Here comes rook to d8, which is a good move because maybe it bluffs at the idea of d5. I guess one thing we should probably note is that probably black can't really play d5 right away after something like captures. I'm not even 100% sure what the next move is. Maybe we have bishop b5 in some positions to undermine the knight because the e-pawn. And so maybe we play bishop d2 first to guard this pawn, and then we have immediate threats on e5. So I think the real issue for Carlsen is, as aggressive as he might have wanted to be, I don't think he can do d5 without permanently weakening the e-pawn and creating immediate tactical consequences. So he plays rook d8 to be prepared. And now we've reached that position where the gridlock needs to go away. It's hard for either side to really keep doing anything if they don't try to break with either d4 or d5. But the problem with playing d4 right away for white is that after bishop takes, queen takes, it's weakening in the center in such a way that probably you're going to end up losing pawns. Capturing here and then playing a move like knight takes d4. If you take on c8, I have an intermezzo with check. So at the end of this line, I did indeed win a pawn. And if you don't take on c8, I don't really see any other tactical ways to deal with it. So let's say if d4 can't be played by white as long as he's maintaining his side of the chicken of the staring contest, then is it time for me to take on e6? Well, Karjakin decided it was. He took on e6 because after f takes, he gets to have a little bit of an extra tempo from what he had earlier, where this rook was already in the ideal location, ready to start moving this knight. Let's get some tactics going on the f file. Let's get the party started on the king side. Black's not in a position to do that now, and so if I can follow taking e6 with immediate striking d4 myself, I know I'm undoubling the pawns, but at least here white is not losing anything tactically, as the variation I just went for with that intermezzo on f3. And so if the position opens up, maybe I can get more built-up access to the e6 pawn. Maybe I get queen c4 in a couple moves and try to take advantage of that. Now we started to get some trades. B takes c3 is played with the intention of opening everything and following up the series of trades with the very, very obvious and strong move rook to b4. It hits the undefended bishop, but even more importantly, it puts pressure on the a4 pawn. One of the lines that I analyzed here instead of the move rook to b4, if we're going to show that, is that what if black doesn't play rook b4, but maybe plays queen d7 right away? The problem with being a little more passive in the approach is now white can change the structure for good with e5. And here we're looking at a position where black actually has two weak pawns, isolated e6, isolated a5, versus white's only one weak pawn. So a slower approach would allow white to strike with e5. Playing e5 yourself as black is just a weakening move. You're, again, opening up access to the light squares. Maybe even knight f5 right away looks kind of fun just because it threatens to take on e7. So there really isn't any other way for black to deal with the threat of e5 besides the move rook to b4. And after rook c1 with tempo, the queen comes to d7. So, and, now we're headed for a position that's going to be a forcing series of trades because white can't afford to lose the a4 pawn without going for a5. But if white commits to getting the a5 pawn in exchange for a4, he can give up on any idea of ever breaking with e5 and trying to get that positional advantage, right? So probably Karjakin was maybe a little bit in the driver's seat for a second after taking e6 and getting d4, if he could somehow manufacture this breakthrough I've been talking about of e5 that would weaken e6. But because Carlsen was accurately defending with tempo, he doesn't allow that idea to come to fruition. White commits all in to winning the a5 pawn in exchange for the a4 pawn, which, as I said, means that whole idea of e5 is gone. Now that bishop is pinned, so again, e5 would just probably be losing material if I had to guess, probably after takes, and then if queen takes, maybe something like just building up on the pin. I don't know, like I can trade queens, and if you trade everything, it looks like you may actually still get out of this sort of scenario with some sort of tactical idea. But, very dangerous for white, and you're not going to be in a position at all to justify e5 by taking advantage of the weak e6 pawn. So instead, Karjakin decided it was time to trade, which meant, as you can probably start to hear in the tone of my voice, we were looking more and more like the first game of the tiebreaks would be a draw. After queen c6 and the king moves, king f7, why not bring the king in? There's not really any danger here, plus it guards e6. The last real chance was maybe right here after f4. Carlsen perhaps perks up a little bit like a shark. He smells blood and plays bishop d8 and says, hey, maybe my opponent will miss bishop b6 and I'll checkmate him on g1. Unfortunately, that was not to be the case, and after queen to d1, saying, hey, I see your threat, Carlsen decided to essentially offer the draw with queen to d5. And after the trade, that is exactly what we got. So on that note, you're looking at what was the tale of the first tiebreaker game. Hopefully you enjoyed the educational breakdown here for all those of you who didn't know what the result was and are checking out the results of the World Championship via the tiebreaker videos on YouTube. Thanks for doing that, and leave your comments in the below the video here. I'm trying not to reveal the results as we analyze them to maintain whatever excitement and tension we can that remains in this World Championship match. And look forward to our next video analyzing Game 2 of the tiebreakers where Magnus Carlsen has the white pieces against Sergey Karjakin.